I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I'd like to acknowledge that this land was never ceded and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and particularly to their storytellers, because they are part of the oldest continuous storytelling tradition in the world, and what we're here to talk about today is all about story. So there are inevitably slides, so hold on a sec. I hope you can see those now. According to the UNHRC, more than 33 million children were forcibly displaced by the end of 2020, including 11.8 million child refugees and around 1.3 million asylum-seeking children. Although children make up less than 1/3 of the global population, they're almost half of the world's refugees. In spite of these overwhelming numbers, very few child asylum seekers will find a home in Australia. The Department of Home Affairs' latest annual report reveals that last year's refugee and humanitarian program was the smallest in 45 years. While the world was ravaged by COVID-19 and violence flared around the globe, Australia's borders have been closed. The majority of Australians welcome migrants. Business leaders demand the economic growth they see in migration, and the country prides itself on multiculturalism as a result of 20th century migration. But public opinion on asylum seekers is divided and continues to be a significant political issue, ironic for a settler colony. A series of governments of different political persuasions have clamped down on people arriving by boat, introducing offshore processing and the increased use of detention centres, often in inhospitable areas such as former mining camps or isolated rural towns. These policies have been furthered by media coverage and political commentary found to dehumanise the people affected and migrant communities more broadly. The 2004 Human Rights Commission inquiry into children in immigration detention found that thousands of children, including unaccompanied minors, were held in detention for up to 2 years. The longest detention the inquiry documented was 5 years, 5 months for a child and his mother who were eventually granted refugee status. So, as Deborah Dudek has noted, texts for young people often respond to and represent a political climate in which they are produced. So it's no surprise that a substantial number of books for young people that represent the experiences of child refugees and asylum seekers has been published in Australia, with most of them overtly advocating for the rights of these children. At least 10 young adult novels and picture books about asylum seekers imprisoned in detention centres were published between 2004 and 2006, a time when there was heated political debate about the Human Rights Commission inquiry. The next concentration occurred between 2014 and 2017, with 5 picture books issued in 2015 alone, approximately the same number as have been published over the previous 6 years. That second phase occurred during a concerted community campaign to end the detention of children, following a further report by the Human Rights Commission in 2014, which found that the prolonged mandatory detention of asylum seeker children causes them significant mental and physical illness and developmental delays in breach of Australia's international obligations. Today, I'm considering 3 very different Australian books published internationally at that time, which propose forms of love as possibility in opposition to this image of isolation and despair. These books are The Arrival, a graphic novel by Sean Tan, published in 2014. Suitable for all ages, The Arrival has become an iconic text, awarded many times over, taught in schools, adapted for the stage, and even presented as a major musical event by the Orchestra of the Underground with a score by Ben Walsh. In Tan's painterly detailed and fantastical illustrations, it tells a classic story of migration. A man in a city threatened by monsters, shadowy tentacles, which may be violent or economic peril, leaves his family and daughter to journey to a new country. There, he faces bewildering language, systems, cultures, and creatures, until eventually he finds kindness and employment, and his family arrives to join him. My Two Blankets, a picture book for younger children, is written by Irena Coble, herself a migrant, illustrated by Freya Blackwood, and was also published in 2014. It won the Kate Greenaway Medal and the Children's Book Council of Australia Book of the Year Award and many other prizes. It is the story of a girl whose life was once so carefree that her auntie called her Cartwheel. But then came the war, and she and her auntie are now alone in a strange place. We came to this country to be safe, she says. Everything was strange. The people were strange. Even the wind felt strange. The narrator, whose name is erased after the first page, weaves the blanket of her own language and story around herself to protect her. But it is not until she meets another girl in the park who begins teaching her their strange language that she is able to weave a blanket of new words just as warm and comfortable as my old blanket. The Bone Sparrow, a young adult novel by Zana Freyon, was published in 2016. It too won or was shortlisted for many awards in Australia and internationally, including winning the ARBIA Book of the Year for older children and being named a Carnegie Medal Amnesty Honour Book. An adaptation for the stage is due to tour the UK from February. Lucky people. The book is set in a detention centre in remote Australia where the protagonist, Subi, was born and lives with his mother and sister, hoping to hear news of their father's release from prison in Burma. It's classified for readers from primary school up, but is, frankly, a tough read for the younger age ranges, with detainees sewing their lips together, going on hunger strike, rioting, and in one case being murdered by a guard, all of which have happened, of course. It is, however, a story of hope, and above all, of the power of dreaming, language, and story. As Freylon has said, we can walk in the darkest places imaginable in a book and experience a taste of someone else's reality. We can wonder and we can hope for the happy ending. Now, some of you may find it surprising that children's authors are interested in guiding young readers through the darkest places imaginable. But as Philip Nell has written, the children's picture book is the ideal medium for voicing that unsettling feeling when something unbelievable suddenly becomes true. Its visual metaphors render difficult emotions clearly and illustrate children's literature's ability to express dark realities in the language of the fantastic. Indeed, each of these books uses a sophisticated metaphor and storytelling technique to present human perspective on lives that have been too often seen as controversial political issues rather than as people. Further, as Freylon explains, they are aimed at young readers on whom the stories will have the most significant impact. She says, children and young people have the imaginations and the insight to be able to really step inside someone else's shoes in a way too many adults have forgotten how to do. And more than that, young people have the courage to question all those absences and silences in our worlds and to imagine our future in a way that adults no longer can. The fact that all three texts were so highly awarded is not only about quality. It says something about the importance placed on the issue by educators and librarians who often make up judging panels and are, after all, directly concerned with children's welfare and with children's stories. The sheer number of children's books on migration and on the refugee experience for all reading ages in many countries and languages reflects this interest and the publisher's acknowledgement of its importance to young readers. An increasing number are written by adults who were refugees as children, such as Ando's memoir, The Littlest Refugee. Story is one of the key ways in which we understand the world and our place in it. preoccupations of the younger reader as they mature and come to knowledge about the world around them. These books do not all feature child protagonists and are aimed at different age groups and engage with different experiences of forced migration. But they do use the power of narrative to create in the reader an empathy with the migrant or asylum seeker experience and illuminate its hardships. Specifically, they all engage in a metafictional sense with language, story, or reading as potential strategies to humanize the dehumanized. According to Amy Fish, by portraying migration from a young people's perspective, children's books allow us to examine the implications of making children the protagonists and spokespersons of migration. Not surprisingly, children are often used as the face of the asylum seeker experience, their stories told in news photos or words. Non-government agencies, media, charities, and activists are quick to focus on the needs of children in detention or in refugee camps, or the experiences of child migrants. Tactically, this makes sense. And realistically, of course, children are suffering deeply. But these appeals to conscience or for donations do not engender agency. The child in these situations is often lost, vulnerable, innocent, and one-dimensional. Their identity is not that of a unique child. Their identity is as victim of war, of bureaucracy, of fear. Authors and illustrators too have chosen to centre texts on children to convey the vulnerability of the asylum seekers' experience. But as they're creating fictional characters, they bring to it their knowledge of the child as reader, the child as independent protagonist, the child as story. Layla Savsar has written of the critical importance of centering children in migration stories. She says, these are the sites where children are ideally reborn as subjects with agency, where they are free to remember, reimagine, and rewrite individual and national identities in the eyes of the other. But as children's authors ought know all too well, their readers have no time for didacticism. Instead, the focus is often on emotion and knowledge creation, allowing younger readers to make connections between their experiences and those of the story, to use their growing understanding of the world to work out for themselves what it means and how it makes them feel. This is extremely technical work, underestimated by some, and these authors and illustrators are all expert and accomplished. As illustrator Blackwood explains, I find great satisfaction in trying to depict the difficult emotions of a character. I work very carefully to capture facial expressions in minimal line work and enjoy finding the best colours, composition, and viewpoint to subtly intensify those emotions. I hope that a gentle portrayal of serious themes can be experienced without overwhelming the reader. All of these books, too, use some aspect of the fantastical, the metaphorical, the imagined to undertake the cultural work of witnessing. The Bone Sparrow is built around stories, the stories Subi tells the reader, himself and others, and the stories his family and friends tell him because he was born in the camp and has no other home to tell stories about. Subi's father is a poet, imprisoned for telling stories. His friend Jimmy, who lives outside the camp, cannot read the stories her mother left her. They are folk tales, but also family stories of the bone sparrow pendant Jimmy inherited. It is Subi who reads the stories to her. This subverts the ways in which children's books are often read, with meaning and words being, in the term suggested by Joe Sutcliffe Sanders, chaperoned, where an adult reads or supports learning and interprets the world of the book for the child who is listening. In The Arrival, the world appears alien, truly alien, to both reader and protagonist. The script on the billboards and newspapers is indecipherable, creatures unworldly, boats fly in the air, and all the systems that make up society are unfamiliar and therefore uncanny. There are no words in the book, but an extraordinary emotional pull on each page. Tan has explained that The absence of any written description plants the reader more firmly in the shoes of an immigrant character. There is no guidance as to how the images might be interpreted, and we must ourselves search for meaning and seek familiarity in a world where such things are either scarce or concealed. The fact that there is no text in The Arrival is not a lack, far from it, but it echoes in silence, the silence also experienced by Cartwheel in My Two Blankets. However, none of these books is attempting revolutionary approaches to gender and love and their connections to ideas of home and family. Dudek has noticed the unchanging narrative of home and hope presented in books for children about migration and asylum. Many folk tales and children's adventure stories begin and end with ideas of home and feature journeys. In stories of migrants and asylum seekers, these structures and familiar concepts are present, with the home at the end not a place of return, but a new place of hope and acceptance. This can sometimes offer a conservative view of the destination country. Asa Warnquist claims that, in fact, many Swedish children's books on migration extol the virtues of Sweden as a host country, reinforcing self-congratulatory nationalist stories rather than highlighting the experiences of refugees in flight. The Bone Sparrow is scathing about the host country, which feels nothing like a home. But it's fair to say The Arrival and My Two Blankets end with a relatively traditional view of migration. So too, all of these texts focus on community, friendship, and family, often in gendered ways. All feature a girl breaking through the barriers of isolation to offer kindness, and women as caregivers appear in each story. The only scene focused on men in My Two Blankets is a double-page spread of fear and alienation. In The Arrival, the people to break through the Arrival's isolation are another man and his son, also refugees, who share their own story of flight. And in the detention centre in The Bone Sparrow, the younger men are kept separate from the women, children, and elders, literally, by high fences, so that Subi is separated from his best friend Eli, who shifts into manhood and active resistance with tragic consequences. These are not books about romantic love, although there are stories within the story in The Bone Sparrow which mirror one another's tales of heterosexual pairing and longing, the folk tale told in Jimmy's mother's book and her father's deep grief over her loss, and Subi's mother's despair after she received news of her husband's murder in prison. Tan's Arrival is the classic migration tale of the father who leaves his home country to create a future for his wife and child. Cartwheel in My Two Blankets has no family left except for her auntie, who cares for her but never speaks. But love and hope are central themes in each text. Love in the kindness of strangers and the offer of friendship or welcome. Love in the protection of family against hostility and even violence. And love in particular in the sharing and presence of story. Gendered love happens also in the reading of children's stories. The process of reading a picture book together is, at its heart, one of love as well as literacy. And this is often gendered, seen as a task of parenting or caregiving, tasks which are still more often performed by women in Australian families, at least in heteronormative households. Many books for children on the migrant experience, even memoir, are published in the language of the country in which the migrants arrive. This suggests a range of potential readerships. Firstly, for children who are not migrants, to help them understand the experience of children or people they know or see on the news. Secondly, for children of migrant families, to help them understand their carers' experiences, or perhaps those of an earlier generation. And thirdly, some are aimed at supporting children who are recently arrived. In any of these modes, the book may also act as advocate for understanding, empathy, perhaps fury. Both My Two Blankets and The Arrival are positioned to be read universally. The country and culture of both home and destination are imagined or open to interpretation. Sean Tan has said that The Arrival is influenced by stories of his father who migrated from Malaysia. He says, I became aware of the many common problems faced by all migrants, regardless of nationality and destination, grappling with language difficulties, homesickness, poverty, a loss of social status and recognisable qualifications, not to mention the separation from family. I have a recurring interest in notions of belonging, particularly the finding or losing of it. Visually, the book is also clearly influenced by the widespread migration of the early 20th century, the familiar scenes of arrivals at Ellis Island and the views of the Statue of Liberty given a speculative twist in Tan's hands. Zana Freylon's motivation for writing the Bone Sparrow was more overt. She has said, I chose to write The Bone Sparrow as an act of activism, in protest and shame at living in a country that seeks to lock up innocent people. As an author, my power is in my words. As a result of public pressure, including the influence of these and other books, children are no longer held in detention centres of the kind represented in The Bone Sparrow. However, they can still be detained and are, either in community detention, a form of house arrest, or in one infamous case on Christmas Island, where an entire decommissioned detention centre was brought back into use to house one family with two small children. Meanwhile, detention of children in other senses continues unabated. Indigenous children are still much more likely to be removed from their families and more likely to be placed into youth detention than non-Indigenous children. And as we all know, these experiences are not unique to Australia, and these stories are still as necessary as ever for children and for adults. I'll leave the last word to author Zana Freylon. If something I write can help just one person to remember the people behind the statistics, to listen for the voices and the stories rather than just seeing policies, or if it can help just one person to imagine a someday where refugees and asylum seekers are treated with the respect and compassion we all deserve, then we as a community are one step closer to a future I want to be part of. Thank you.